So a few days ago, I was scrolling through my LinkedIn feed and I came across this article about occupational health, especially for leaders. And I thought that's exactly what we are talking about in this channel here. Piqued my interest, but what was even more interesting is that it has been written by an old friend of mine, Daniel Wend. For those of you who are new here, my name is Kai. Here on this channel, we learn to lead and we lead to live. We do that by sharing perspectives on leadership for ourselves and others. If you want to be part of this community, then consider hitting that subscribe button. Now, Daniel is a psychologist and has his own occupational health consulting firm. And so I called him up and asked, would you mind sharing a few thoughts with this audience here? He kindly agreed. And so without further ado, let's turn towards Daniel, who is joining us from Frankfurt today. Daniel, great to have you with us today. Would you mind just introducing yourself briefly and tell us also what brought you to the career paths that you've taken?
Hi, Kai, and thanks for the invitation. Great having me here. So my name is Daniel Wend. I'm 43 years old. I have a master's degree in psychology, and I'm heading the psychosocial counseling unit within a big German company. And on the side, I have my own consultancy firm on health and leadership issues, And personally, I'm deeply passionate about mental health topics and about, the impact leadership behavior has on the health of the workforce in general. So that's basically my passion and my topic.
I imagine that's something that has changed quite radically in the last 12 months, has it?
Oh, yeah, definitely, Kai. That's right. Many leaders, many managers, they became, let's call it crisis manager, in the corona pandemic, basically overnight, and everything changed overnight last year, also from a leadership perspective. Leaders, they must now deal with challenges that they might have never experienced before. For example, they are faced with tremendous insecurities, financial strains, and, even existential fears within the workforce.
What's your advice to those leaders? What do you suggest?
My personal experience also as a leader is that, people factors, I would call it, became even more important in the crisis. In a situation where distant or virtual leadership, as you just said, became rather normal, And I think what's crucial is having the right and positive attitude towards my staff. Also, in the new collaboration situation, being in contact. Emotionally in contact, asking questions, listening, and showing appreciation, being authentic and honest, and also being interested in the person behind the employee, also showing trust in the virtual collaboration situation, focusing on the strength rather than on the weaknesses, providing positive emotions even in this very difficult situation. And I think all this is extremely important and also needed, in the current situation.
Those are really interesting topics that you mentioned, especially trusting the employees and giving them a feeling that, it's not all normal and it's not all business as usual, but as leaders, we often have to just instill that feeling that we are still on the same track and we haven't suddenly changed as leaders. I think that's quite important as well. So how has it affected yourself in your interaction with employees?
Well, I would say for me personally, as I said, the emotional aspect of the relationship has become even more important. And I try to strengthen that emotional connection, being in contact, showing trust, all the stuff that I mentioned before. I try to live this also, in the virtual world. And I think that it's possible because it's not about, leadership techniques in the end. It's about my personal attitude. And I think this is the core message in the end. And I can show this attitude towards the employee basically in any circumstances,
Yeah, no, I get that. And I think it's a great inroad also to your article. I told our audience earlier already that I came across your article on a LinkedIn feed, thought it was really brilliantly written.
Thank you.
I can link it in the description below as well. It's written in German, but it may still be relevant for some of you. But you have explained in that article like a 3-column model, one of which is the self-care for leaders.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I think taking care of myself as a leader is I would say, the important precondition to take care of my team. And only if I'm as a manager, if I'm resilient myself and stress resistant, I'm able to tackle, the daily challenges as a leader. And, Kai, there are many studies out there indicating, that self-caring managers, they positively influence the health and also the performance of their employees. And being a role model in this aspect is a enormously powerful factor here. And however, what we see in the current crisis, that many leaders, many managers, they shift in some kind of emergency mode, and they forget or at least neglect their personal self-care.
It's great advice. I mean, as you were speaking, I was just thinking, I would love to, but many of us are faced with enormous restrictions around us. You can't go outside, you can't travel. I know myself, I'm probably traveling usually just for vacation 3-4 times a year, and I haven't done so for a full year. So it's really difficult to have that type of self-care. Any tips what you are doing to ensure that you take care of yourself?
First, the general recommendation is focus on the small stuff. Not the big ones, the big hobbies, the big travel plans. Of course, this is not possible, but focus on the stuff that you can apply in your daily, restricted home office work, for example. I mean, personally, I started, for example, doing modeling again. I used to build models in my childhood, and I restarted, And I love it because I can do it, even in the restricted environment here in my home. But it gives me so much joy and strength. And this is, my recommendation. It can also be, something funny, but do it and do it regularly.
What type of models do you build? Is there any particular thing you like, or?
Well, in the end, it's planes, airplanes. I'm building airplanes.
I guess for anyone who is watching now, if you need an airplane model,
Oh yes, that's true.
Contact Daniel.
And the modeling is not the important part, but as a psychologist, the emotion, behind it, that is important, because it gives me so much, childlike energy and joy. I'm in a flow when I'm doing this, and I can forget all my stress. So doing, doing this kind of stuff creates positive emotions and has a big impact.
Self-care was one of the things that you talked in your article about. The other one was obviously caring for your staff, and you've already mentioned quite a few things of how you can do that as a leader. But the question that came to my mind was also, a lot of us are not, like yourself, trained psychologists. Are there any signs that we should watch out for that give us an indication that maybe somebody needs a little bit more attention?
Well, as you said, luckily, I would say, as a leader, we don't have to be a psychologist, we don't need to be trained as a therapist. What's important is, again, to be in close contact to your employees, even virtually, and watch out. And this is important, watch out for changes in the behavior of your staff. For example, is the performance decreasing? Is the colleague maybe, socially withdrawing? Is he or she becoming more nervous, testy, or even aggressive? Or our sick leave is increasing?
Right.
So, the change in behavior, I think this is crucial. As a leader, it's then important to address this topic with the employee as early as possible. I would underline this, as early as possible. In a confidential feedback session, for example, giving feedback as concrete, but also as appreciatively as possible. And then, what's important, offer relief and support, by providing, for example, access to professional help, such as coaches or psychologists.
So many good things, Daniel, that you point out here. I mean, one thing Daniel mentioned before is he's also building up his own business about occupational health. And what I'm interested in is, some of us say, well, we are doing all of these things because we are in a pandemic and it's unusual circumstances. And once we are through it, everything goes back to the old normal. I'm just curious, Daniel, what do you think might fall away by the wayside, and what are the things that truly are here to stay when we think of ourselves as leaders, but also for the workforce in general?
It's a good question. I've been thinking about that. For me, the main learning point is that we learned that we can maintain emotional connections to people in a virtual collaboration setting, even if we don't see the people, our colleagues, but we still can do, have that emotional connection. And that is, I think, a very important asset that we should carry over to, the post-corona area, I would say. Now, the second learning is that during the lockdown situation, I think many people became more modest. We refocused on things and values that really counts in life. For example, family, relationships, friends, positive emotions, and of course our health. And I think that's a very good development. And I think we should keep that healthy mindset. And also leaders. I think it's important for leaders sometimes to refocus their values. I think that's a great learning.
Moving on in the 3-color model that you described, one of the things that was very prominent in the article as well was creating the right work conditions. Yeah. What do you mean by that, Daniel?
In practice, I think it's a rather fine line between, pushing challenging projects and overloading your employees. Mm-hmm. And, of course, there are always phases in our work life where we have to push our team, to give everything, to work extra hours, to go the extra mile, as you say in English, in order to meet the deadline for an important project. But however, this overburden should not become a normal working situation. And from a health-oriented perspective, leaders should protect their teams from chronic stress and excessive demands. I think this is important. Right. And this can be done, for example, by setting the right priorities as a manager. Distinguishing between urgent and important, and by optimizing processes, for example. That's also important, reducing process waste, as we say in the lean management area. Also creating a culture where a 80% result is appreciated and not the 120% result only,
So true.
And I think leaders also must learn to say no to their own superiors, to set borders for themselves. And my experience is that sometimes this is a difficult learning process for managers.
Yeah.
And my second recommendation is that also, take into consideration the work-life balance of your employees as much as possible. Calling your team on a weekend or writing emails late in the night, expecting a prompt response, it disturbs the regeneration phase and should be the absolute exception.
Not only that, but especially in the time where we are all working remotely, my experience is that a lot of employees started to work a lot longer and at a lot more odd hours than before, because now there's so little else that we can do, that it's probably even more important to have that time set aside to say, well, this is actually my time, I'm not looking at anything.
Yeah, exactly, Kai, because the borders between private and professional life, they became blurry,
Yep.
And I come back to the point that we discussed before, considering the private person, the human being behind the performing employee, trying to understand the private situation wherever possible without being, of course, intrusive, I think this is important. And what we can say in general, if we ignore, this human being behind the employee in our daily leadership routine, it's likely that employees, even the high performers, sooner or later become frustrated or even sick. They might develop psychological problems, such as a burnout, or finally even leave the company. And I think we don't want to have that, long-term consequences.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Those are such great thoughts. I think there's a plentiful source of information here that we can take away and think about it. It's interesting. All the things you say are things I have thought about and experienced, but not explicitly, right? We live our lives and we experience things are suddenly different, and some of the things are quite good, but it's really helpful to have somebody like yourself just pointing them out point blank to say, this is what it is today. And I think a lot of leaders can find themselves in what you are saying. And I personally can find myself in that as well. So Thank you very much for that. That's really invaluable. There will probably be more articles from you. Maybe one of these days we'll have another chance to talk about the changes as they come along, maybe also when we get out of the pandemic. But for the time being, thank you so much, Daniel. It was a pleasure to have you here
Welcome.
with us.